Hello there. Today I'm looking at a wine that's classified as a Bordeaux Supérieur. This is Chateau Larteau. It's the 2022 vintage of that. And what has brought Chateau Larteau to my attention was the fact that I stayed there during my recent visit to Bordeaux. Now, Chateau Larteau has a long history of winemaking dating back to the 18th century. There are parts of the winery and the barrel cellar that date back to the 1870s. I think portions of the barrel cellar date to 1876. And there was a time, I'm told by the estate's now co-owner Denis Chazerin, that the wines from this particular region on the south bank of the Dordogne River near the town of Arveyres, a few miles south of Liban, were actually hugely popular. It's an area where you can get grapes quite ripe and thus you get quite an intense flavour. And according to Denis, sort of 100 years ago or so, some of the wines from this part of Bordeaux were actually more popular than the wines of Pomerol. More recently, however, Chateau Larteau went through a period when it was owned by a Chinese businessman and his associates, in a period when in 2016 and 2017, Mr Chi Keung Tong purchased Chateau Larteau and also Châteaux Senilhac in the Medoc, the tiny Clos Bel Air estate in Pomerol, and the Emilion Grand Cru Chateau Saint-Pierre. These estates were acquired at relatively low prices in situations where they'd been family owned, and with French inheritance tax being levied at 30%, and families whose descendants weren't interested in carrying on the tradition of chateau owning, their new Chinese owners were able to pick these estates up quite cheaply. And initially they were really quite interested in investing in the wines and trying to improve the properties. One of the changes that disconcerted many locals was the renaming of the chateau. For instance, Chateau Larteau was renamed Chateau Imperialrabbit. I think the idea was that this was a modern approach to branding that would appeal to Chinese consumers. I'm not sure that this necessarily worked, because I think the new owners had difficulty selling these wines. And then in 2019, the Chinese government started imposing some quite strict restrictions on the flow of capital out of China, making it much more difficult for investors such as this to buy chateau in Bordeaux and to continue investing in them. And then with COVID coming along in 2019, I think it was impractical for these estates' Chinese owners to continue to run these estates. So in 2022, somebody called Denis Chazerin and his associate Pierre and their company Domaine de l'Emissaire purchased these 4 estates just immediately prior to harvest. Once they completed the 2022 harvest, they set about addressing some of the issues that these chateaux were facing. And one of those approaches was to return Chateau Larteau to its original historic name that consumers had known it by. However, there was also investment both in the winery where new equipment was purchased, and significantly at Chateau Larteau in the vineyard where 5 of the 7 hectares of vines there were replanted. They've also done a lot of work on the chateau. The estate there is a beautiful place to stay, I can attest to that. But they've renovated it with an eye to it being used for seminars, for weddings, and its location, it's an idyllic setting on the bank of the River Dordogne, and they've really made a good job of these restorations. As far as the vineyard is concerned, it's planted entirely to merlot. The average age of vines here is 25 years, and sustainable viticulture is practiced here. They're certified under the HVE3 certification, which is a common sustainable viticulture classification in French vineyards. Denis was telling me that their approach to improving winemaking here has been to try and make sure that wines are being made by plot as separate batches rather than simply focusing on vinifying the whole estate in one go. So much more sympathetic vinification within parcels. Now, this is a Bordeaux Supérieur. It's not a particularly expensive wine. It's machine harvested. Fermentation goes on in cement tanks. There's temperature control. Now, some of the notes I've seen from journalists reviewing the wine suggest that this wine, the 2022, at the stage they tasted it, was a little heavily oaked. So my assumption is that it has spent time in oak, Certainly there are pictures of barriques in the literature, so I would assume it's probably spent a year in French oak, but I don't know the specifics of how much of that is new, whether other barrel sizes are used or anything like that. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? First thing I should say is it has a good, deep, dark colour. There's a touch of sort of mauve at the rim there, but generally it's a ruby red. I can see through it, it's not opaque. As I swirl it, the wine is clinging to the glass quite happily and is very slowly, oh there we go, yes, forming tears on the side of the glass. Now according to the label this has 15% alcohol. As I say, it's quite typical for this region with quite heavy soils that manages to achieve good ripeness for merlot, a grape variety that can get up to 15%. This isn't necessarily what they were aiming for. As I say, the estate was purchased in 2022 and really the purchase went on just on the brink of harvest. So the new owners were forced to pick the fruit in the state that it was in at that stage. Possibly they might have picked earlier had they have had more control over that. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? I find those aromas quite impressive actually. There's an intensity, there's a richness, there's a ripeness. There's a spectrum of fruit through from lovely fresh juicy raspberry with spicy touches to a dark red plum and a black plum, and then there are notes of bitter licorice towards the end. So there's quite a lot going on there for what is not a very expensive wine. It has quite an impressive intensity and concentration. So let's see what it's like on the palate, shall we? Tasting that as a warmth and a richness right from the outset. There's a reasonable density of smooth, supple, velvety textured tannins. You have those darker fruit elements. There's a dark red plum, a black plum, prune notes. And there is perhaps a lifted red fruit, a touch of sort of juicy mulberry coming through there. And then there's that concentrated licorice note, perhaps a bit more sort of chocolatey cocoa notes towards the end there. And that cocoa note's coming in with that very velvety, smooth, tannic texture. Now the wine has richness, it has alcohol, and at first the acidity seems quite soft, but actually as I'm sitting here, there is a sort of a delicate, lifted red fruit coming through. Those, I was talking about mulberry notes, perhaps a touch of juicy raspberry. Those are overcome by the chocolatey and licorice notes towards the end, concentration. Perhaps the alcohol and its warmth is closing up the finish a bit, stopping those perfumes from being able to come through. But again, I'm quite impressed by the way that the ripe fruit is balancing the weight of the alcohol, and the freshness is just keeping a little bit of that red fruit perfume alive to the end. I had a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this wine, and a number of critics have rated it, and it has a rating of 87 out of 100. I think it might be a little hard done by that. As I say, some of the critics noted that its oak really rather stood out. Now, I'm not seeing that, and they probably tasted this wine at its release, and if that oak has settled down a little and is giving me now much more sort of chocolatey notes that are more harmoniously married to the fruit, so maybe I'm seeing something slightly different in the wine. I'm not claiming it's a fine wine, I'm not claiming it would score 90 points plus. But I think this is probably a wine that's worth 88 or 89 points. I think it's providing some excellent value. And I will leave a link in the notes through to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine so you can see what the pricing is. So I think you may find yourself quite favourably impressed by the value for money that this wine offers. I don't think it's a wine for long aging. I think it's probably a wine that might age for 5, 6, maybe 7 years. But actually, its softness, its richness, its ripeness and its suppleness probably means it's best consumed within the next 3 or 4 years. Because I don't think you gain a lot of extra complexity or mellowness for keeping it that little bit longer. It doesn't need time to smooth out. And actually, if you kept it too long, the alcohol might start to overpower the fruit. But as it's tasting at the moment, I think that if you like big, rich, fruity styles of wine, this is a straightforward appealing wine that you might very much enjoy. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, do please press the like button. That would be really appreciated. If you have any friends you think might like to watch it, do please feel free to pass it on to them. Also, do consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. If you do that, that's a real help, and also that way you can set yourself an alert and you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting video. If you have any comments, please do pop them in the comments box below. I would love to hear what you have to say about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. So yes, once again, thank you for joining us, and do come back and join me for another tasting video in the very near future, won't you? Till then, bye for now.